Okay, so when we talk about refrains, we're talking about a vibratory affective ontology. Refraining names the vibratory becoming and differentiation of assemblages, the expressive wholes which, in emerging, territorialize affect and lay claim to identities. The refrain is the affective vibration which bridges and attunes assemblages and ecologies that connects and articulates like a joint. So, as Franco Berardi says, when different refrains start singing in time, there occurs a shared world. The refrain is the passage, the pulse which moves between and stabilizes or reiterates, normalizes rhythms, or destabilizes, alters, undulates, or makes the rhythm skip or engineers a phase change. So the refrain is between, it's virtual actual. And in the refrain, possible worlds come into contact with real worlds. It can transform existential states, break down blockages, free up a line out. Even though refrains perform this very concrete and material work, they don't belong to a space and time, but rather, as Watson says, effectuate specific spaces and times. So in that sense, there's a kind of weird temporality to the refrain. It conditions experience super-empirically. It controls the complex set of emergent tendencies which ground empirical functioning. And this means that its real power is not something that can be consciously perceived in the present as it's taking effect. We perceive its effects only after they've occurred, after they've been smoothed over by consciousness, if you want. The present of the refrain, the time in which it operates, is skipped over by the force of its past rhythms. Meaning that the present, as Brian Masumi says, appears only in its next effect. And for Masumi, this unusual accent functions as a kind of syncopation of time itself. The patterns produced by refrains are reality-giving, they're worlding. They function as attractors or tendencies, and the reality they give is a protocol or an algorithm for becoming. And to this extent, we must approach Guattari's affirmation of this post-media era with a note of caution. He very much embraces this post-hegemonic informational autonomy that can be used collectively to resist what he describes as the deadening influence of mass media. But today it's all too clear how these kind of self-organizational networks within wider cultures of what we are increasingly calling big data are easily integrated within logics of control. And yet, I think what we're arguing here is that it's amidst these networks that any current attempt to reinvent photographic practice, no matter how minor, necessarily takes place within those networks. So our new historical context, the media ecological era, is, as Berardi suggests, one that refrains liberation but also induces a paralyzing sense of panic. Social attention is bombarded to brutal effect. Collective subjectivity is traversed by vectors of continuous, compulsory communication. And in such a scenario, the photograph is not a separate object of contemplation, but part of what he describes as the flow of existential events, part of the refrains which constitute the social field and through which bodies perceive each other. And yet, even in a world in which mass media has lost its old dominance, dominant photographic refrains continue to function as aesthetic attractors, organizing subjectivity on the basis of a singular, universal time. Accordingly, any kind of counter-refraining processes must be aimed at subverting this temporality. And even these subtle syncopations to which Masumi refers, syncopations to photographic refrains, can, as he says, put into movement new possibilities of existential assemblages within the everyday. So I'll just end really by briefly kind of speculating on how we might work within and beyond certain photographic genres, and maybe kind of think about where the excess lies in these refrains and these cliches. Where are the lines of flight? So as suggested, generic refrains are not simply transcendent categories, they're immanent aesthetics of everyday practice. And the task as we see it is to distinguish between the two types of immanence Guattari identifies, between the immanence that functions on an empty repetition of the same and the immanence in which even minor difference provokes points of bifurcation and processes of resingularization, that is, processes of change. So we might start with photography's moral impulse, the war zone. Instead of simple embedded animals, embedded, and we're here thinking of kind of embedded notions of journalism, in which we function as photographers through bundles of affective routines, triggered by blood trails and signs that point towards the front line, primitive kind of notions of truth. Perhaps we can better perceive the complex spatial collapse between circumscribed zones of war and the apparent banalities of the everyday, a collapse precisely brought about by the new temporalities of our media ecology. And from here we might follow the war photographer's tendency to retire to the land. We're thinking here of Don McCullin, for example, very much a kind of feature of a film recently released about him. The war photographer takes comfort in landscape. But instead of idealized romantic objects of contemplation, in which the landscape functions as layers of compositional value, almost kind of mechanistically brought together by the photographer's natural instinct, perhaps we might learn from the plants within this landscape, from the weeds, a process which, as Michael Marder suggests in a recent book, philosophically discussing the power of the weed, means, quote, unlearning the objectifying approach to the world and losing oneself instead in what he describes as the vegetal middle. From this middle, weeds can spread far. As we know from Deleuze and Guattari, the and of rhizomatic offshoots can pervade all manner of arborescent genre and can even poke through into, say, for example, the unyielding concrete of the street. As we all know, in photography's small history, the street is the site of its commanding myth, where its techniques are unencumbered by the pictorial traditions that beset its other modes. But these are streets in which we as individual photographers would do well to set aside our Leicas, give up our quest for decisive moments, and reject the desire to capture a fixed society in ever closer detail. Instead, we might set about grasping the potential of this society from within, spreading our weeds by fabulating new ontological trajectories. And here, fabulation is something distinct from the discursive function of photography's tendency towards self-storifying and self-storytelling. I think something which is extremely prevalent in various kind of efforts to historicize itself in the last couple of years. On the contrary, this process of fabulation taps into what Guattari describes as, and I quote, the non-discursive at the heart of the discursive, end quote. Which is to say that in order to fabulate a world, as he says, one must start from a point that is unnameable, unrecountable, which is the very point of the rupture of sense and the point of absolute non-story. And in this way, then, the street might become a space in which new rumours can be spread, new collective tempos, which might function, in the words of artist Francis Alice, I may have pronounced that incorrectly, as, quote, parallel circuits of diffusion and circulation, a process which creates new social maps rather than simply tracing ever more reverentially what already exists, as, for example, in maybe the tired refrains of socially engaged practice. So once these fabulatory networks begin to function, any of our photographic refrains might become reorganized according to its new intuitive rhythms. The portrait, for example, has long been understood in liberal political context to have ethical power, to function as a mechanism for the mutual recognition of an essential humanity through which individuals might reconceive themselves, an acknowledgement of their various differences and sameness. Here, though, as a weed, as a noisy interruption to normative signals, it might become something more powerful, more attuned to a 21st century ethology. The face and the subjectivity it embodies would not simply be restricted to the human, nor would our photographic perception of it simply operate by scanning for possible punctums. Instead, this face would be entangled with the non-human processes of our media ecology. a face that would never be complete or reduced to protocological possibilities, but would remain open to the kind of virtual potential which generates glitches in our standard perceptions and codified representations of the human. However, and just to kind of refer back to a point that Dean made earlier on, for us, one of the most significant outcomes of these virtual rhythms is what they suggest in terms of pedagogy, in how they expose the refrains in photography education. So at the University of Lincoln, we're experimenting and we're exploring with the potentials of a post-media era through a pedagogy of excess, a pedagogy of the rhizome, if you like. And very briefly, in opposition to what's become the overriding business logic of current university culture, in which the student is cast as a consumer, this radical initiative advocates collective social teaching and learning in order to produce something that is not known or defined ahead of time. And as we see it, this is the ethical obligation for teaching and learning photography within new media ecologies. Any counter-refrains must be collectively fabulated, rejecting the principles of these kind of self-expression and individuality and independence, which are essential to the conformism of the so-called creative industries and have come to dominate, I think, our practices. And so finally, we need to admit that these speculations towards forming new assemblage are necessarily scary, necessarily painful. And I think those of us engaged in this project are all kind of scared to venture outside of this circle. We also are remembering what Deleuze and Guattari tell us, that it's not a matter of entirely giving up a circle of forces in favour of chaos or consensus in favour of dissensus, but rather cultivating an art of doses, singing under our breath, whistling a tune that's partly recognisable but at the same time partly improvised. Chaos is, of course, the pure refrain, the full spectrum refrain. And so the photographer's struggle with chaos is a matter of rendering it sensory, as Barbara suggested, of activating the fullest conditions of photographic perception. And in what's become the conventional tendency to capture empirical objects, even from multiple viewpoints, photography anesthetizes against these excesses. It suppresses the world's painful, chaotic forces, or we might say in Bergsonian terms, technopoetically fabulates a perception of the world on the basis of such anesthetic refrains. In contrast, then, to activate its fullest perceptual conditions would be to exploit these powers of the false, to produce a photography capable of, as Deleuze and Guattari say, a composition of chaos, neither foreseen nor preconceived. Because the empty canvas is never really empty, and because the unexposed photographic print is never really blank, it's only through contact with the painful limit experience of photography, only with a flash of chaos, that we can hope to experience something truly aesthetic. Thank you very much.